It will not shirk its responsibility to the next generation and to the nation at large to prevent the inflation of another property price bubble.
There'll be about 10,000 first-time buyers who will be locked out of the market.
We'll still have to find money for rent, whichever that is, in our retirement, because we'll not be in a position to have a, mortgage-free home.
But is the central bank right to try and save us from ourselves? And what impact will it have on apparently runaway prices in our capital?
Even though house prices are a good deal off the peaks we saw in 2006, 2007, they're not cheap by most measures.
We've completely lost connection between rental values and market values in Ireland.
If fewer will be able to buy in future or choose to rent, just what will be available to them?
I'm the chairman of the housing agency and I will never buy a piece of property again. I rent.
And can we learn anything from Germany, where nearly half the population rents rather than buys its own home?
You have to pay your rent and you have nothing to care about. And they cannot rise it as they want. So you are very, very safe.
Even if you were going to buy a new house, you would have the kitchen units, it would be plumbed, you would have the sink.
I know.
Where is everything?
I know.
For those who can afford to buy, will there be enough homes for them to purchase, given the tiny number of new units constructed in recent years? And is our attitude towards damned developers hindering a recovery?
I can't see this market recovering without developers. But there are people who don't believe there is any role for developers. And when that crazy misunderstanding exists by a lot of people in this country, you're not going to solve the development situation.
Tonight we're asking, how do we solve Ireland's housing crisis? So here we go again. We're back, it seems, in something of a property boom. We're here in a new development, Miller's Glen, on the north side of Dublin in Soar. It's been built by Jerry Gannon, who of course is one of the famous property developers who is in NAMA. Miller's Glen featured very prominently in the media in recent months because when it first went on sale, we had queues here of people not just wanting to see the show houses, but to put down deposits as quickly as possible in case they would lose out.
Every time an offer is made, the people bid higher.
There's just no properties out there at the minute and the bidding wars is absolutely crazy. And yeah, it can be very stressful at times, like the bidding wars is going up 50 grand over the asking price.
The number that queued overnight for houses in the first major new development in North Dublin for 7 years was small, and they didn't sell out immediately despite the hype. But it did indicate how few properties are available for sale. But were first-time buyers worried about the prospects of overpaying?
No, I don't think so, because we have a good deposit behind us and our mortgage is not that much. So, and even the repayments, like some of our friends that are renting, they're paying nearly the same or more.
I mean, the lady in there said the next phase is going to be more expensive than this phase. So already, without even having built, laid a brick, the price have gone up.
Many economists are predicting prices will go up again in 2015 by about 10% in Dublin, with a single-digit price increase nationally. But not everyone agrees.
House price rises in Ireland are coming to an end. The normalisation and recovery is definitely well underway at this stage. This is led by some very desirable areas, particularly in parts of Dublin and some parts of Galway and Cork. Once that period of initial profiteering, so to speak, has gone through, they will stabilise as supply and demand come back into equilibrium.
Many experts argue that this isn't a bubble because there's no easy availability of credit. They say that price hikes are simply down to a lack of supply in housing. The central bank, though, was still worried enough to step in, prompting a quick backlash.
Strict new rules were unveiled today by the central bank in a bid to take the heat out of the property market. Most borrowers will need a 20% deposit and loans will be capped at 3.5 times their income.
Reports today suggest the government may be looking at a new insurance scheme which would help potential buyers get on the property ladder.
It's one of many issues that are being considered by the government. I've quite publicly said I think I was the first government minister to come out and say I think the 20% threshold is too high.
The problem with lending during the bubble years wasn't necessarily 90 or 92% mortgages. It was 100% and 100% plus mortgages that some banks lent, and sometimes for multiple properties. If the central bank is really serious about dealing with the mortgage issue, why doesn't it encourage long-term fixed interest rate mortgages? which are common on the continent and which are more certain and cheaper for people than the variable rate mortgages, which of course can change almost without warning. There's a possible unwanted side effect to this central bank imposition. If it reduces demand, it means there's little incentive for developers to build, as they'll find it hard to shift stock, and the banks in turn will be reluctant to lend to them.
The evidence that they're putting forward, when you actually examine it, is not well-founded. They use examples like Sweden, where they said, oh, they did it in Sweden, but look at the results that Sweden got. Their property market is still spiralling out of control. They use examples like Finland and Canada, but in Finland and Canada, people regularly use a type of insurance to circumvent the loan-to-value rule. And I don't know why, when lending is completely anemic, where loan volumes are so low that they were last seen in the early 1970s, that we have this emergency measure coming in now. And this emergency measure won't make more houses, and that's what the problem is.
None of the banks or the Irish Banking Federation agreed to be interviewed for this documentary. The Governor of the Central Bank, Patrick Honohan, has since suggested that there may be some relaxation on the proposed rules, but not everyone disagreed with the proposal.
But we need to avoid making the same mistakes again, and there certainly was tentative evidence that banks were again lending on very high loan-to-value ratios and on very high loan-to-income ratios. And I think the issue of whether the deposit required is 15 to 20% is a debatable issue. I don't think there's any great science in that, and you could argue that it should be 15 rather than 20. Even though house prices are a good deal off the peaks we saw in 2006, 2007, they're not cheap by most measures. If you look at, say, the ratio of average house prices to average incomes in Ireland now, it's about 5.6. which is much higher than the UK and much higher than the long-term average and what many people say is a sustainable rate of about 4 and 4.5. So house prices are already quite high. So I think it is important at this stage to try and do something to stem, at least limit the rate of price increases going forward.
If you look at the price index since 1991, housing is still something like 250% higher than it was in 1991, compared to the consumer price index, which is only about 70% higher. So housing is still massively overvalued.
Affordability tends to be the great silent secret about housing in Ireland. Irish housing, Irish expectations of profit from housing, Irish expectation of the value of land for housing are disconnected from reality. We've completely lost connection between rental values and market values in Ireland, and that recovery still has to sink in people's minds. Well, I'm the chairman of the housing agency, and I will never buy a piece of property again. I rent.
This, to anyone thinking of buying a house, is not exactly a vote of confidence, given that it comes from the head of the state agency tasked with advising the government on housing policy. But has he shared his concerns with the government? Is it possible that the government has been quite happy to see prices rise over the last couple of years and to do nothing about it because it's helping the balance sheet of the banks?
I do think I would be very worried that there is actually a significant chunk of the cabinet anyway that certainly thinks in those terms. I think actually Michael Noonan said it himself. Sure, if we could only get house prices to go up another few percentage points, sure, we'd be fine and no one would really lose out. Well, that's not the way it works. The cost of accommodation, whether you buy it or whether you rent it, is a key measure of our competitiveness. If we decide the cost of building is too high relative to the price, you can either get the cost down or you can get the price up. And that one's much better for competitiveness and much better for providing accommodation for everyone. Unfortunately, the government looks like it's gone down the other route. Let's get prices up, and that's the way we'll get building going. It's trading off the needs of the people who bought in the last 15 years against the needs of the people who are buying in the next 15. We should have a policy of cheap and affordable and abundant good quality housing. That should be our housing policy, not trying to get house prices up because you think it's going to get you re-elected.
Some of the recovery of prices that has happened has been simply to actually bring prices back to what would be a more normal level of price of a house in a European country like Ireland. But the suggestion that anybody would like to see a bubble or would in any way promote a bubble, I just think that would be just totally unwise.
There's a marked difference between the housing market and prices in our cities and many parts of rural Ireland. But some of the issues faced by the construction industry before it can get supply going again are common to both, as we can see at the Clondara estate in Clonard in Wexford Town. Until earlier this year, the road wasn't finished, and there was also several half-finished apartments and duplexes, until NAMA stepped in.
They finished the footpaths, knocked all of these, demolished them. There was no further requirement for these. It was patently obvious there was no further requirement for these. I very much doubt that there will be building in Wexford in the next 5 years. Some of the land that was purchased during the boom was so expensive that even if a developer could have held on to it, it wouldn't make economic sense to build now. In fact, it is cheaper to buy than it is to build at the moment. So a developer will not take a chance. With the new building regulations that were introduced in March, it's getting more and more and more expensive to build property.
Even though price increases are lagging far behind Dublin, Dolores tells us that there's a shortage of family homes here too.
Basically, if more bungalows had been sold and built during the boom, but again, there was an element of greed among all developers. We can't use up all the land for a bungalow because it takes up the space of 2 semis. So let's not build them. Now we have a situation where there's a huge demand for bungalows, where people just want to retire, have their guest room, but be near everything, and that would free up housing stock that they have. There are elderly people, when I say elderly now, I mean my own age, where their families are reared, they're gone away from home. What do you need a large 4-bedroomed house for? You don't.
Here in Dublin as well, we're told that the cost of building is prohibitive. You could put that down to the whinging of developers, but even NAMA, which is the state agency, agrees that at current prices, building of apartments is not profitable. The government is partly to blame for that, with the taxes and levies it has on every individual property. If it was to change those, it would lose out on money, but might gain through all the extra activity. And in addition to that, what about all the construction work that would become available, taking people off the dole and generating extra taxes? The government's 2020 construction strategy was launched in May 2014, promising action, but new supply remains almost non-existent.
One of the big disappointing features of the recent budget was that they did virtually nothing on the supply side. Their inaction is inexplicable to me.
Cork developer Michael O'Flynn, who built Ireland's largest residential building, the Elysian Tower, predicted 4 years ago that we'd have this housing shortage. He believes that there was never oversupply in our cities and that it'll take us another 2 to 3 years to sort this problem out.
The scale of criticism towards developers was extraordinary. I think it was people did not understand what we did. They did not understand the scale of some of our businesses. They perceived major borrowings as being somehow bad business. I can't see this market recovering without developers. But there are people who don't believe there is any role for developers. And when that crazy misunderstanding exists by a lot of people in this country, you're not going to solve the development situation. We have been excluded from a lot of rooms where decisions are made as regards how can we recover the situation. Unfortunately, that is still continuing. I don't think the development sector are a key part of the strategic thinking as to how to recover.
Our ideal holiday?
An ideal holiday? Well, it's when you find something new.
Somewhere quiet, somewhere isolated. Get out, get up a mountain.
Somewhere where we can just laugh together.
Somewhere you can get really fresh food. It's when you go somewhere and it's so great that you don't want anybody else to know about it.
Making your way in the world today takes everything you've got. Wouldn't you like to get away?
At McDonald's, all of our beef is 100% Irish, 100% local. That's because we source it from Board Bia quality assured farms and local farmers we know by name.
Everybody knows your name.
To the guy who eats cereal for dinner, to the takeaway speed dialers, to the girl who likes to spice things up. to every time-squeezed mum and to every barbecue-burning dad. Erin says you can cook. With new Erin dine-ins, you can cook Thai green curry, tikka masala and a whole range of homemade, world-inspired meals in minutes. Erin, you can cook.
Ready for a breakthrough?
Rimmel London's new wonderful mascara. Formula with argan oil leaves lashes feeling conditioned. Flex brush defines with dangerous precision. The secret weapon to perfectly smooth, full zero clump volume. Clumps killed, full lashes revealed. New wonderful mascara with argan oil from Rimmel London.
Get the London look.
We were all friends and fans back then. We still are now. The band's back in town and the gang is back together. So missing the big show for a pounding headache? Pain, you're off the playlist. Tonight, it's all about us.
Don't let tough pain hold you back. Reach for Panadol Extra with a clinically proven combination of ingredients to relieve tough pain, even migraine headache. It starts to work in as little as 10 minutes.
Panadol Extra. When tough pain is gone, life takes its place.
We're said to be obsessed with property and owning our own home. Apparently, it's something in our nature. During the boom, people took on massive mortgages for 35 years. But was there some method to the madness?
Ireland was the only developed country in the world without an annual property tax, with full mortgage interest relief, and with no capital gains tax if you make a profit from selling your family home. In those circumstances, it makes sense that everybody is going to buy their own home, because you have to live somewhere, so either you get this free money from owning your own home or you pay a rent.
The government says that this idea that we should all ultimately aspire to home ownership, seemingly no matter what the cost, played a big part in ruining the economy and hurt many people. The government wants a housing policy based on choice, fairness and equity across tenures. But has anything really changed?
After the crash, there was a shift in behaviour and people did begin to prefer renting rather than buying. Now that we're seeing both rents and prices change and both increase, whether that will encourage a further change in people's tenure choice.
There's no longer mortgage interest relief, there's some sort of property tax. We may have capital gains tax and owning your own home. That balance may shift. But I genuinely think that most people, when they're looking at somewhere they're going to live for 10 plus years, will buy rather than rent, because the math stacks up. You'd need pretty high returns on the stock market to get you to rent and invest your savings instead of say, buying your own home.
For those who have any savings to invest, this is what the head of the housing agency thinks.
So in Ireland we have a culture of wanting to own houses. It's changing quite rapidly, and we are going to see quite a marked shift as we go into the next generation of people who are well able to buy choosing not to. So we're going to have a voluntary rental sector as opposed to an involuntary rental sector.
If the new central bank rules come in as first announced, many potential buyers may have to rent instead, even if they don't want to. This despite a shortage of rental accommodation, issues about standards and claims of overpricing. With rents rising 11% nationally and 14% in Dublin, how do we create a culture where long-term renting is regarded as acceptable and affordable? How do we create a situation whereby tenants can feel that they have security where they live and also can be certain as to what their rent increases are going to be? On the other hand, what about the responsibilities of tenants to their landlords?
Are you a bear doesn't frown?
No.
Are you a chicken upside down?
No.
Ed and Michelle are renting a two-bedroom house in North Dublin with their 2-year-old daughter Ruby. They say if central bank rules come in as first announced, they'll never be able to afford to buy their own home in Dublin.
To look for 60 or 70,000 and already being able to get a mortgage towards 40, that's just, we're not going to be in a position to do that. 30,000, could be achievable. There are ways and means to get that.
End of the year, you're wondering if your rent's going to go up or what's going to happen. We have friends whose landlords put up their rent by like 20%, 21%, something like that. Like just because that was what it was. They knew they could get for it.
How frustrating is that you don't have a place that you know you're going to be living?
Yeah, I find that very difficult. that I've had to put her name down 4 schools, 4 different schools in and around Dublin. Now that's obviously to do with the shortage, that's not just to do with housing, but we've moved once since we had her, so her name's down then in 2 different areas, and you're reluctant to take it off of school because you don't know, you might have to go back there.
My sister lived in Germany for 10, 15 years. She's lived in the same place, same 2-3 bed place since she moved there. She rents. It's yours, and you can do what you want with it. Once you kind of leave it in the same state when you go, and it's a long-term renting. So ideally, that sort of a condition here would be great if we could do that.
The Private Residential Tenancies Board, the PRTB, advised the government against introducing any form of rent regulation. Its consultants believe this would lead to further rent increases and other unintended consequences for tenants.
30% of landlords wish to exit the sector as soon as possible. So as soon as prices rise, you're going to start to see landlords exit the sector. This is even higher again amongst those landlords that we would classify as accidental landlords. And it's up to 36% of those landlords wish to exit the sector as soon as possible. So it's a big issue.
DKM is recommending rent certainty leases. So an annual rate of increase between landlords and tenants is agreed at the start of the lease. It also wants landlords to provide the price of 3 comparable properties to justify any increase in rent. We've seen the rise of so-called professional landlords, large investment firms of pension funds that manage hundreds or even thousands of apartments. But 80% of landlords in Ireland only own 1 or 2 properties. Landlords are paying a lot more tax on their rental income, and sometimes it's not enough to cover their monthly mortgage repayments and other expenses. Some landlords are living in fear of banks changing their loan agreements. For that reason, DKM has suggested a whole series of tax breaks to encourage landlords to stay in the sector and others to come in and invest.
The report actually said that for the landlords to recover, to meet their outgoings and meet the taxation requirements, rents would have to go up 25%.
At the moment, leases run for 4 years following a 6-month probation period. After that, the landlord has the right to evict a tenant. DKM also recommends leases of indefinite duration.
I'd be very concerned about that, because there is a large cohort at the moment of what I would call as vexatious tenants, who know how to play the system, who can make life very difficult and you cause havoc for both landlords, property managers and fellow tenants alike. And this window period is a godsend to landlords who happen to have the misfortune of having these people in their accommodation.
What about those who need help from the state to house themselves? The state has spent very little on new social housing in recent years, claiming it can't afford it, although it didn't spend very much during the boom years either. Any borrowing undertaken by local authorities or by the state goes on to the national debt. But the current arrangement is extremely expensive, costing about €1 billion per annum in rent supplement and other housing measures. And it's not exactly working for the tenants either.
We face a stark choice as a community around social housing, in my view. Our options are to not provide it and have people living in private rented accommodation, which often is not good quality, costs the state quite a lot of money, and the costs tend to rise during a recession. But even now with rent allowance, landlords in a lot of parts of Dublin won't accept it, and people who are claiming it find they can only get housing in one part of the city. Our other option is to try provide social housing for people that's a more sustainable, secure tenure. In my view, we should return to some kind of a borrowing-based system to fund social housing. That's the model that's used throughout the rest of Europe. So we need to find a way of funding social housing by off-balance sheet borrowing.
We need to clarify the role of the state in the provision of affordable housing. Should it return to the direct involvement in construction and ownership as it had in the past, or is there a greater role for housing associations? The recent budget announcement of €2.2 billion investment in housing seems significant until you drill into the figures. There'll only be about 1,000 new homes built over the next 3 years, with the bulk of the money going into refurbishments and the renting of existing properties. Dún Laoghaire in County Dublin has 4,500 people on its social housing waiting list. In the past, the government has partially relied on the private sector to build social housing. Under a thing called Part 5 planning, developers had to set aside 20% of their zoned land for social and affordable housing. But the plan failed to deliver.
I think in about 10 years we've built about 300 houses. I think Part 5 didn't deliver very much at all, because in most cases the local authority accepted cash rather than actually getting the social housing that we needed, and that's part of the reason we're in such a mess Now, the money that they got in from development levies absolutely should have been used to build social housing, but the government weren't giving approval for these things because essentially they were moving in the direction of privatising the provision of social housing. And that's something that was started by the last government but has been continued and in fact accelerated by this government.
The government says it is reforming Part 5. New private housing developments will have to deliver 10% rather than 20% for social use. But the land swaps and cash loopholes of the past will be closed.
I think the social housing requirement is a serious one. I think it's one for everybody to be concerned about, and it's one that we as a country have to deal with. And the developers are not the solution. It's going to inhibit private developments, so you're creating a bigger problem than what's there already.
But of course 10% of zero is zero. And with buildings sluggish, could another big player in the property market offer another solution?
NAMA sites, either developed or under construction, should be given over to the local authorities to provide social housing. And indeed, I would say that the cash reserves that NAMA has built up, it has approximately 4 billion in cash from the sales of its property. That money should be invested in a big public housing programme.
NAMA declined to be interviewed. The other big government reform is a thing called the Housing Assistant Payment, or HAP. This is to replace rent supplement. The money is paid directly to the landlord, and the tenant gets to keep the payment even if he or she gets a job. The problem is that when you accept HAP, you are considered to be housed, and you lose your place on the social housing waiting list.
A large number of the people now on our housing lists are single people, or they're one parent with one child. The number of families, for instance, with 2 children or more than 2 children is a relatively small proportion of the total numbers of people on the housing list. The vast majority of them are actually single. So that does require different kinds of approaches. And there has been and continues to be a potential for some and a significant amount of supply to come from the private sector through landlords who are involved in housing supply as a serious business. But I also think there's room for local authorities.
It's clear whether renting privately or with help from the state, we need to improve things for both landlord and tenant. Could Germany, a nation of renters, provide us with any answers?
Making your way in the world today takes everything you've got. Wouldn't you like to get away?
At McDonald's, all of our beef is 100% Irish, 100% local. That's because we source it from Board Bia quality assured farms and local farmers we know by name.
Everybody knows your name.
However you enjoy energy, switch to SSE Electricity today and get Ireland's cheapest home electricity offer at 20% unit rate discount. It's just one of many reasons why we're proud to make a difference.
Beauty is confidence. I think the best beauty tip is just to smile. And smile like you mean it.
For gifts to make everyone smile this Christmas, it has to be Newbridge Silverware for the nicer things in life.
Gucci Guilty.
The fragrances for him and for her.
We were all friends and fans back then. We still are now. The band's back in town and the gang is back together. So missing the big show for a pounding headache? Pain, you're off the playlist. Tonight, it's all about us.
Don't let tough pain hold you back. Reach for Panadol Extra with a clinically proven combination of ingredients to relieve tough pain, even migraine headache. It starts to work in as little as 10 minutes.
Panadol Extra. When tough pain is gone, life takes its place.
Frankfurt, home to the European Central Bank and the Bundesbank. Germany's often held up as an example to us of a place where they do things sensibly. 53% of Germans own their own home. This is the lowest rate in Europe bar Switzerland. And it's lower in urban areas like Frankfurt, where over 80% of the 700,000 residents are tenants. So why have so many decided to rent?
Fluid, liquid rental markets, plenty of property available traditionally to rent. Strong legislation protecting both tenant and landlord. High transaction costs as well in buying properties. The responsibility that comes with ownership of a property. None of these things have traditionally appealed necessarily to Germans until such time, as I say, as they perhaps are saving for their old age or ready to settle down, which comes at a much later age generally than it does for us in Ireland.
The German government doesn't encourage home ownership. There's no such thing as mortgage interest relief, and Germans typically have to raise 20% for a deposit. This seems to have helped them escape a boom-bust cycle.
Between 1992 and about 2010, there was no effective rise in prices of German residential. There was a bit of a peak and a bit of a spike after the reunification period, but prices moved sideways for about 20 years. So the recent run-up in German real estate prices or in German residential prices of the last 3 to 4 years is a relatively new phenomenon.
German officials are horrified by the low interest rates that have been set by the European Central Bank, because that removes the incentives for Germans to save. Instead, they're spending, and not just on consumer goods. It seems that Germans are now much more interested in buying property. German banks usually fix mortgages for the first 10 years, whereas in Ireland, variable mortgages tend to be the norm. But for those who rent, what is the balance of power between landlord and tenant?
That depends on whom you ask. If you ask a landlord, he will say it favors the tenants and the other way around. But I think that they favor the tenants.
Margaret has been renting the same apartment in Frankfurt for over 30 years. Leases are for an indefinite duration in Germany, yet she's also a landlord.
You have your apartment, you have to pay your rent, and you have nothing to care about. And they cannot rise it as they want. So you are very, very safe. I think it would be better to be a little more like in Ireland, because it is better to own something. You have you are more related to your town. I think it's better, but I don't think that it will change here, because the most people are tenants, and so the laws are for tenants.
Not everyone agrees that tenants hold the balance of power in Germany, as we found out at the local Mieterschutzverein, our tenants' rights association.
According to the German law, it is possible to increase the rent within 3 years for 20%. When you want to rent an apartment in Frankfurt, there are 20, 30 or more tenants who look at this apartment, and the landlord will take the tenant who pays the sum of money, the rent which the landlord wants him to pay. There are many people who are homeless, and there are also families who sleep with their children in cars.
Student accommodation is also scarce. We were told of students who had to sleep on camp beds in a gymnasium at the start of the college term this year. And for those who can find somewhere to live, it seems the percentage of income they have to spend on rent is very high.
Average income, for example, a police officer, a nurse or a teacher, a person which has 2,000 or 2,500 euros in a month needs about 50% of the income to rent an apartment. And this is a very extreme problematic case.
There is social housing in Germany, but Rolf says there simply isn't enough of it because the government stopped building it. We've travelled to the Sachsenhausen district in Frankfurt to get a tour of an apartment built by Prinz and Schwenk.
So, please come in.
So Peter, tell me, this is what size now, this particular apartment that we're looking at?
The size is 92 square meter.
Is that a fairly big apartment by Frankfurt standards?
It is fairly normal for 2 bedrooms.
As you can see, the apartment is unfurnished, which is the norm in Germany. The rent is €1,200 a month or €1,400 including bills. You can paint the walls any colour you like, but you must return the apartment in the condition it was given to you. We got a surprise when Peter offered to show us the kitchen. Hang on, this is just a room, this is a shell. If you were in Ireland and you were going to rent somewhere, even if you were going to buy a house, a new house, you would have the kitchen units, it would be plumbed, you would have the sink.
I know.
Where is everything?
I know. Now the thing here is, normally in Germany when you rent an apartment, it comes usually without a kitchen. In this case, however, the tenant negotiated the kitchen to be put by the landlord for extra little money per month, because they said, we don't want to buy a kitchen and then maybe after 3 years be stuck with the kitchen.
One of the interviewees we spoke to today said about that rents can be put up by 20% in a 3-year period, and then can be put up by another 20% in another 3-year period.
I have not seen any landlord doing that.
Why not?
Because it's very difficult. The 30% require that the apartment justifies 30% more than the average. The landlord has a lot to prove if he wants that. And tenants, when it comes to this, they are very clever. They go through the whole thing and say, this is not true, this doesn't fit, and they go to the, where you've been, the Mieterschutzbund, and they work out exactly how much it can be raised or not. Sometimes they find even out they're already paying too much. It cannot be lowered, but the landlord has then no chance to raise it. So this is just a very theoretical thing.
We were also told today an estimate that for in many cases now, for people who might be in public sector jobs such as nurses, teachers, policemen, that they may be paying 40 to 50% of their net income to get the accommodation that they require to rent. Have you heard such stories?
Yeah, I know people sometimes have to pay that much. I don't recommend it. People should stick with about 30 to 35% if possible. Sometimes it's hard. Yeah.
That seems like an awful lot of money on rent when it isn't something you're going to own, when it's something that's just rent.
But these are exactly the people who don't qualify for a loan.
According to Eurostat, 17% of Germans spend more than 40% of their disposable income on housing. And what about the often heard contention that continental Europeans are more open to raising their families in apartments?
With 1 child is okay, but as soon as you have 2, it becomes difficult and expensive. Very expensive. It's a good wish, yeah, but it's difficult.
Larger 3-bed apartments suitable for families are included more in new builds, but many Germans still opt to move to the suburbs, where they can buy a semi-D with a garden.
There has been a big change in the last 3 years or 4 years. Germany was not typically investment-oriented with property. Of course, there were always buyers who bought, but not like looking at it to sell it again and make profit and then sell it again and buy another one. That was not typical German behavior. And many people were afraid to buy property, actually, because property meant if you take a loan, you have debts. They didn't look at, okay, there's a value against the debts, yeah.
Peter said this apartment would fetch between, wait for it, 400 and 420,000 euro. I came here thinking that the Germans were sober and careful and that we could learn a lot from them when it comes to providing accommodation. But having visited this apartment, which is in an area very like our Temple Bar in Dublin, and having discovered that it's valued at 30 times the amount that you can get for it in rent, I'm coming to the conclusion that the Germans are storing up problems for themselves. They're behaving like we did a decade ago, and that they could have very big trouble ahead. So we've heard conflicting German views on the rights of tenants and landlords. We decided to get an Irish perspective from some expats living in the city.
Nobody wants to rent back home, again, because of the quality of rental properties. Here, the quality of rental properties is much, much more higher. People rent for life here. I mean, it's characteristic to rent, especially in the cities. The laws, they're very favourable towards the tenant. So a landlord can't come and say, you're out next week or you're out in the month. So the minimum termination period is 3 months. After 5 years, you add on another 3 months. After 8, another 3 months, and after 10, another 3. And the landlord, if he wants to sell the property, he has to prove that he actually needs the money.
John, who's renting in Frankfurt, agrees landlords don't hold the balance of power.
A good example is recently we moved into a place last November, and my girlfriend was moving out of her place, and there was a similar kind of thing about how to terminate her rent contract. And the guy had said it was for his own use, and that's another reason why, which can be a reason for terminating a contract. He needs it for his own use, and then it was able to be proved later that it was on the market, which was, it's like over here it's illegal, it's something you're not allowed to do. You really have to, it's not easy to kick a tenant out over here.
And was that landlord then punished for having given incorrect information to evict the tenant?
That is still going on. Yeah.
Coming to Frankfurt has confirmed one of the strengths of the German property market, the care and consideration and legal strength given to the tenant. The tenant has security of tenure and is also in a good position to know what the rent will be and how much it is likely to increase in the future. Those of us who remember the causes of the Irish bust have reasons to shudder at what's going on in Germany at present. Low interest rates mean that investors are moving to property as an investment. But it's not just German money. Foreign money, especially from China, is flooding in, and we're finding that prices are rising very quickly and possibly too high. Could it be that Germany is inflating a bubble which will lead to a bust?
You're a giant, a juggler,
Come on, we're going.
a lifeguard. You're a believer, a smoother, a supporter.
Ease up.
You're a saint. You're a healer.
It's not fair. I hate you.
You're a spoil sport,
You're in the middle of nowhere.
a collector,
Sorry.
a memory maker. Who was it said you can't be all things to all people? Toyota, the best built cars in the world.
Making your way in the world today takes everything you've got. Wouldn't you like to get away?
At McDonald's, all of our beef is 100% Irish, 100% local. That's because we source it from Board Bia quality assured farms and local farmers we know by name.
Everybody knows your name.
We were all friends and fans back then. We still are now. The band's back in town and the gang is back together. So missing the big show for a pounding headache? Pain, you're off the playlist. Tonight, it's all about us.
Don't let tough pain hold you back. Reach for Panadol Extra with a clinically proven combination of ingredients to relieve tough pain, even migraine headache. It starts to work in as little as 10 minutes.
Panadol Extra. When tough pain is gone, life takes its place.
We can debate after our German experience whether or not it really is better to rent than buy. It seems that even if people can't necessarily afford to own their own home, they'll stretch to it rather than rent. It seems to be part of the Irish nature. But there's little doubt that whatever people choose or are forced to do, we need more houses and apartments for a growing population. especially in our cities. Because not only have we had very little new housing built in the last 7 years, but our second-hand market is also dysfunctional. But the understandable unwillingness of people to give up tracker mortgages, large arrears on loan repayments, and negative equity discouraging sellers and restricting supply.
There's a lot of buy-to-let properties in the market. There are some executor sales representing about 15% of the product. There are bank repossessions, which are typically buy-to-let. And yet the dominant demand is for family homes. So with a critically tight supply and half of that stock not ideally suited to the purchaser, we're going to see price inflation.
So what type of homes should we be building and where? We're back at Miller's Glen in Swords to find out what sort of homes people are interested in buying.
Is this your first house you're looking for, or are you looking to trade up?
Oh, it's my first house I'm looking for.
Okay, so what are you looking for? What in particular?
Something on the north side of Dublin, close enough to the city but not too close, and spacious.
Oh, and how important is space to you?
Very important. A nice back garden is the main thing, preferably south facing would be lovely.
What are you looking for when you come to look at possibly buying a new house? What's going to be the key determinants?
Love detached. Love the detached. Absolutely love the energy rating. I think that I don't think that's a gimmick. I think that you're helping the environment and you're helping your pocket as well with the bills. Like we used to live in Clongriffin, which is pretty built up. That's where we were renting, and there's no gardens. You know, all the houses are right to the curbside. You know, and your cars are parked, people are walking by your front window and stuff like that.
The housing agency estimates we'll need 80,000 homes in the next 4.5 years. Almost half of these will be in Dublin.
There's a huge range of figures being bandied around by various groups who've got a vested interest in the outcome of saying we need more of something, not least our friends who are builders who want to get back into the building business. The housing agency had a fairly sober look at that and have identified the number of houses that will be needed in each year, in each part of the country, going forward. The 3-bed semi in Ireland has much less of a future, if I can put it that, than it did in the past, mainly because of changes in demographic structure. We reckon that less than about a third of the market requirement is going to be satisfied by those going out into the future. That the household formation that's taking place is a household formation of more and more units with fewer and fewer people in them. Very large numbers of people living on their own voluntarily. Very large numbers of people deferring starting a family until well into their 30s, so their need for a 2-bedroom apartment remains. There's a very large number of people who are looking for what my kids call the friends type accommodation, like the TV show, where they can each have their own individual bedroom but share a communal living room, kitchen area. These are markets that are supplied by the development sector in other parts of Europe. We haven't started to do them here yet. The developer in Ireland who starts to do it will have his arm taken off.
We need to address the phenomenon of the empty nesters, the equivalent of the so-called bed blockers of the hospitals. We're told that it isn't economically viable to build the type of accommodation that they want. Apartments in the same suburbs in which they have reared their families. But even if it was, would the planners allow them?
I am very concerned that the planning lessons are not being learned we are producing densities that are unsustainable in terms of what the market needs. Like there's parts of Dublin where you will not get the development that the market needs. You'll get development that the market doesn't need. So gone are the days you'll fund development that the market doesn't need. This is one of the mistakes that was made. There was duplexes funded in country villages. It was mad. But they were built because the planners insisted on them. So we have to get the planners out of the ivory towers. We have to get what is required where. We can't have developer, before anyone screams at me, developer-led planning, but we have to have developer-involved planning, and we have to have market-involved planning.
If you want to build a north-facing apartment, you can't. That's bizarre. A north-facing apartment will trade at a discount to a south-facing apartment, certainly, but it doesn't have to be a 100% discount. We shouldn't make it illegal to have new north-facing apartments. These are things that the market can work out. Similarly with, say, car parking spaces or lifts and stairwells. These are all technical issues, but they all add costs if you're trying to build in Dublin City Council at the moment. It's exactly like trying to force everyone to have a Mercedes, but not everyone can afford one.
Are the planners right to insist on these standards? And do we need to grow up about city living in Ireland? Dublin House is a pilot project which hopes to show that apartments make good homes for families of all sizes.
We can't continue with this very simplistic response whereby we carpet the suburbs with semi-Ds and we build shoebox apartments in the city centre. You know, that's just not sustainable. All over the continent, all over the States, you have great apartments in cities, and that's what we need to start introducing in Dublin, and that's the point we want to prove here.
How many Dublin House-style projects do you expect you could have around Dublin? How much of the demand for new accommodation in Dublin is that likely to satisfy?
Its value is more in that it will hopefully prompt a rethink amongst developers generally as to how they should be approaching the design of apartments.
If you demand new standards for apartments, are the developers actually going to build them? Because we're hearing from developers that it's too expensive to build the things that you want them to build. You're looking for too many lift shafts. You won't allow north-facing apartments, that you're making it uneconomic for them to build apartments.
You mean what we're hearing from developers is that our demands are we're looking for excellence. And we're looking for generosity in apartments. Yeah, we are. And they're not new standards, they're existing standards. They are in our current development plan, and they were introduced actually in 2008.
All of this suggests that public policy is quite deliberate. Most new accommodation will be built in urban areas and their near surrounds. We're not getting any more building that may lead to ghost estates in rural areas, too far away from amenities and jobs. The planners will hold sway in this regard, finally. But that doesn't necessarily solve dilemmas as to what the public wants and whether developers can get finance to build profitably. We have to accept that about 1/3 of people may never be in a position where they can afford to rent or buy their own homes, and that the state is going to have to provide. That may not be popular because of the cost of providing social housing, and also because it seemingly punishes those who look after themselves without state support. But there is plenty of international evidence to suggest that there is a social benefit in that for all of us.
Countries like the Netherlands and Sweden, Denmark have large amounts of social housing. It's better integrated into the private sector, and it's very successful. Here and also in the UK, access to social housing is very heavily targeted on low-income households, whereas in continental Europe, a wider variety of households get into social housing. So that has a couple of benefits. It means you're integrating different income groups within social housing, and it also means the higher income tenants can subsidise the costs of the lower income tenants. So social housing in some countries in Europe is very successful, and in countries like the Netherlands and parts of Amsterdam, a very large proportion of the population, a majority, live in social housing.
In many ways we are a segregated society, which is very sad. Unfortunately, this segregationist view in Irish society that we'll keep the undesirables, as they see it, over there, and we'll live in this nice exclusive estate. But I think that's not right.
Could social housing become the basis for a larger scale affordable housing supply to benefit a larger section of society?
We have gone from a situation where 50% of our homes in the 1950s were non-market, produced by local authorities or by housing associations, to a situation where 96-97% of housing is produced by the market. You will have nothing but trouble if you only concentrate on this so-called market. It is seriously problematic, and governments must take action. I would call it something different from social housing, because that seems to have the wrong connotations. I would call it community housing. And so you have the nurse, the teacher, the Garda, living next door to the person who's unemployed and on the local authority list, and rightly, of course, receiving priority. But a broader spectrum the state must take on.
We need to stop talking about markets when it comes to having places for our population to live. Housing people is one single issue, and whether people have to be provided for with social housing, are going to rent from private landlords, or own their own homes, is all related and has to be treated in public policy as such. We went from boom to bust. The crazy building of 90,000 housing units each year brought this country to its knees. But we won't get back up again either if we're building nothing. We just need to decide what and how much and get on with it, or else we'll have a crisis in providing adequate and affordable accommodation that continues for generations.
should open a savings account for Jimmy's college.
Which bank?
Any bank.
Not a savings specialist?
Any bank is fine.
What college should I go to?
Any college. Any course.